Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the changes in the provision of social protection in the Mena region since the Arab uprisings. I'm sorry for the short delay. I hope that you can all hear us well. And yeah, welcome. Thank you for waiting. And I'm looking forward to today's webinar, which is organized by the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth and UNICEF's Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa region. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is hosted by socialprotection.org, an online platform where you will also be able to find the recordings and the slides of today's webinar afterwards. I'm very happy to have with us today Rana Jawad from the University of Bath and Markus Loewe from the German Development Institute, who I will present in just a minute. Next slide, please. So please remember that throughout the webinar, you can send us your question through the chat bar and we will collect them and address them in the Q&A session just after Rana's and Markus' presentation. And if you can, please add to whom you're addressing the question to, so either to Rana or Markus or to both. That would help the Q&A session. Okay, next slide, please. So before I give the floor to Rana and Markus, just a short overview of who's speaking today. Myself, my name is Charlotte Bilo. I work at the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, where I'm part of a research team working on child-sensitive social protection in the MENA region. This is a project that we're having together with UNICEF Mena. Next slide, please. So it's a great honor to have Rana Jawad with us today from the University of Bath. Rana is a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. And she's also the founder and convener of the MENA Social Policy Network. If you're interested in finding more about the network, please click on the link below, remembering that the slides will be made available online afterwards. Rana has extensive research experiences in social policy provision with a particular focus on institutional and political analysis of social policy provision. In addition, Rana is interested in social care, social safety nets, and the role of religious welfare organizations. Today, Rana will give a historical overview of the development of social protection, addressing the question whether we're seeing a paradigm shift in the provision of social protection in the MENA region. So I welcome Rana, and before I hand over to her, I would like to present also Markus, our second speaker. The next slide, please. So Markus Loewe from the German Development Institute in Bonn is also joining us today. Markus Loewe is a senior researcher at the GDI and also the head of the research team North Africa and Middle East and North Africa. Markus is an economist by training, and his main research interests lie in the area of social protection, poverty reduction in the MENA region. And Markus has worked extensively on the public pension schemes in the MENA region, which will also be the topic of his presentation today. Okay, next slide, please. So before I hand over to our speakers, I would just like to say a few words about the background of today's webinar. So today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that we are organizing, we at IPC, together with UNICEF Mena. And here I would just like to mention a short disclaimer. So although this webinar series and today's webinar is organized by IPC and UNICEF Mena, just like to highlight that the views expressed by the authors are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of IPC or UNICEF Mena. So in last year, the IPC-IG and UNICEF Mena partnered in a research project to enhance the production of knowledge on social protection in the MENA region. And within the scope of this project, we at the IPC-IG are providing policy analysis for the region as a whole, but also on-demand technical support to individual UNICEF country offices. And within this project, we also have an online community on socialprotection.org. And I invite everyone who's interested in the topic of social protection in the MENA region to join the online community. It's open to practitioners, scholars, academics, but also government staff. So anyone who's interested in the topic, would like to share recent research or disseminate events or vacancies. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So within our partnership with UNICEF Mena, we are working on a number of knowledge products. The first one has been launched a couple of months ago, the one that you can see in the slide here, overview of non-contributory social protection programs in the MENA region through a child and equity lens. This study provides a regional overview of non-contributory social protection in the region, and also includes an estimation of the number of children covered by the programs in the region. In addition, the study also includes 20 individual country summaries for all 20 countries in the region, summarizing their social protection system. And these summaries have also been made available as individual one-pagers and have been translated to Arabic, French, and Portuguese. So if you're interested, you can also find them on IPC's website. And the study also includes, for all programs mapped, an individual program profile, summarizing the main characteristics of every program. And these program profiles have also been made available on socialprotection.org under the program section. So I also invite you to have a look there in case you're interested in more details about the specific programs. This first study was presented last year also as a webinar, and just as today's webinar, the recordings are also available on socialprotection.org. Then within the scope of this project, we have 3 more studies coming up this year. One on increasing the fiscal space for child-sensitive social protection in the MENA region. Another one on legal frameworks in MENA from a child's rights perspective. And the third one is about building shock-resistant national social protection systems. So I invite you all to check the online community where the webinars that will present these studies will also be announced. Next slide, please. Great. And then lastly, before giving the floor to Rana, I would also like to invite you to have a look at the Policy in Focus Social Protection After the Arab Spring, which includes a number of articles from scholars, but also practitioners about the state of social protection in the MENA region as a whole, but also for individual countries. And Rana and Markus have also contributed to this edition of the Policy in Focus. And this edition has also been made available in French and will soon be translated into Arabic, and all translations are available on IPC's website. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Rana. Rana, welcome.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation to the IPC-IG. It's a real honor for me to be involved in this webinar, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about research and policy issues that are urgent for the Middle East and North Africa region, but also that are important to all of us. I'm sorry I cannot see the audience directly, but I'm assuming and I'm sure that these are issues that matter to you, as I know they matter to Markus and the IPC-IG. So as you can see from the title of my talk, there is a core interest in the basis of entitlement in the Middle East and North Africa region. So how is the social protection paradigm or the discourse making us think differently about the way in which populations access public services and access social welfare rights broadly. And could we argue that as a result of this potential influence or shift in interest towards social protection, that social policies more broadly are developing a stronger sense of social solidarity in the MENA region? At the heart of this question is perhaps a more fundamental, conceptual interest that I have in the way in which policy shapes social action. And I'm sure that everybody would agree that public policy is one of the most powerful ways we have of controlling human behavior and controlling social society, even if there is resistance or even inaction. But policy is a very powerful way of framing the organization of a society. And as such, you will hopefully get a sense of that in my introduction, that I'm using the concept of social protection to think about the changes in the provision of services in the MENA region on the one hand, but also at a more fundamental level to think about how the idea of social protection itself is a tool for framing social policy more broadly in the region. And for me personally, I would argue that this is an important step forward for thinking about social policy and development policy changes in this region. I'll very briefly mention that the research has been funded by a variety of organizations. I'm particularly highlighting, as you can see from the logo, the UK's funding source for social science research, which is the Economic and Social Research Council's support that has been quite important in the data that I'm using in this presentation. Next slide, please. So by way of an introduction, the focus, I'm in a way, I'm using the body of knowledge that we have around social protection already from the last 2 decades, and its recent arrival, we could say, comparatively speaking, to the African and Latin American continents, its recent arrival to the Arab region, to rethink what this concept can offer analytically for thinking about social protection and social policy provision in the MENA region, and therefore more fundamentally about these bigger issues related to poverty reduction or inequality. And then from that basis, I would like to say something a bit more of an overview in terms of what we are seeing in the MENA region through the concept of social protection and the policies that have emerged as a result of the interest of this concept in this region. My analytical approach is rooted in the concept of social policy, which is not just the analysis of social services, but also the deeper political and institutional questions about social responsibility in a society, the basis upon which citizens can access public services or social welfare services, whether there is wider social mobilization, and that wider relationship between the state and civil society. So the interest in social protection that will appear through my presentation has this dual question, whether or not we are witnessing a historical moment, if you like, in the MENA region in terms of the rise of non-contributory social assistance, as perhaps we witnessed in Western Europe after the Second World War and the establishment of the welfare state, or are we perhaps at a more pragmatic level simply witnessing operational modifications in service delivery, which is what social protection is allowing us to see in this region, and therefore how effective these will be in reducing social inequalities or improving social welfare more broadly. And you might guess that perhaps these questions are based on a sense of discomfort, if I may say, on my part, in the sense that social protection is presented as a very important paradigm shift. And I do not wish to undermine the growth of interest and the growth of spending that we see towards non-contributory social assistance. But in the MENA region perspective, there is some evidence that we can see from national development plans and from the types of policies that are being promoted on the ground, that perhaps this discursive shift in social protection is not necessarily matched on the ground in terms of policy delivery, and that perhaps the traditional focus on vulnerable groups, on targeted consumption smoothing programs remains quite dominant in the MENA region, and therefore the wider claims about social protection fundamentally shifting systems of social policy perhaps need to be approached with a little bit more caution when we are looking at the MENA region. And this is where the sort of rationale for my presentation comes from. Next slide, please. So just to revisit that, what I'm proposing is that we need to reconsider social protection not just as a technical fix for the policy problems of the MENA region. So whether, for example, we change the different ways of targeting different groups, or the package of in-cash or in-kind programs that we are seeing, but rather I'm asking the question of how social protection itself is based within specific policy communities, and therefore we need to take a step backwards and think about the way in which social protection is being framed as a policy approach, and therefore determining the kinds of policies that can be proposed in the MENA region. Next slide, please. And I will start this by having a very brief overview of the breadth of the social protection debates in the global north, bearing in mind that a lot of the international donor agencies, a lot of the interventions that we see in the global south and the MENA region included, are highly influenced by the international actors and the transnational actors that are working between the global north and the global south. And to a certain extent, this can be considered as a contrast between the broad debates that exist around social protection, what it means, what kinds of policies it can promote, and how these might contrast with the region such as the Middle East and North Africa. Next slide, please. So the first thing to point out is that the social protection as a concept is actually quite broad and encompasses not just public expenditure, whether it's on social assistance, on social security, but there are also two very important pillars to the concept of social protection, as I highlight very briefly here, certainly in the Western origins of the idea of social policy. These are the role of taxation and the role of social regulation. I only need to mention the current events in Jordan and the mention of the idea of income tax and the social mobilization that has emerged partly in response to the proposal of the government to increase income tax as one way in which we have perhaps neglected other factors that are relevant to social protection. Perhaps our focus has been more on public expenditure, specifically the expansion of social protection for non-contributory social assistance. But it is important to bear in mind that there are other two very important pillars related to fiscal policy and related to social regulation and the institutional framework for social protection, which I think it is important for us as researchers in the MENA region to draw linkages to and to expand our research on. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another critique, if you like, or another perspective, to put it better, for social protection is what some authors, such as Guy Standing, have already highlighted. Perhaps this might be a little bit of an exaggeration for some authors, but there have been some cautionary notes that some researchers have expressed in relation to social protection as a result of the influence of globalization and the financial constraints on various governments. This applies not just to the global north, but also to the global south. So here there is a list of 8 potential crises, which Guy Standing mentioned in an ILO report a few years ago, highlighting the challenges that faced social protection in the global north. But we hear much less about these potential challenges perhaps in the global south, and I just wanted to highlight some of these issues in terms of us understanding the way in which social protection is changing or what impact it would have in the MENA region. Next slide, please. Another important parameter of the debates about social protection, which we've tended to hear less of in the Global South and especially in the MENA region, is the traditional fault line between the targeted social assistance approach and the more universalist public service provision approach. There is a historical record of research in the Global North, which really emphasizes the importance of citizenship rights being the basis of social policy provision, and especially the expansion of economic rights, and also the importance of universal public provision as perhaps the most effective way of reducing social inequalities. And yet again, at the moment, at least, we've tended to focus more on the social assistance approach of the social protection paradigm. And this is an important element of the debate that needs to be considered in the MENA region, I would argue. Next slide, please. Another important element in terms of considering the social protection debate, and this is also relevant to the MENA region, is to think about the issue of regulation and institution building. Some authors would say that we've now moved away from the Washington consensus, and that the social protection paradigm represents an important shift towards a different philosophy of social provision. One important point I would mention perhaps is that the literature on the Washington consensus tells us now that perhaps the failure or the incomplete implementation of the Washington consensus in some countries, Russia or China or India, was perhaps related to a lack of in-depth understanding of the institutional frameworks of this paradigm. So one important issue for us to bear in mind is, how do we ensure that social protection is institutionally embedded in order to guarantee a greater degree of success? Next slide, please. And so therefore we move to thinking about the translation of these debates and how perhaps they have become narrower in moving to the Global South. And this is very much from the MENA region perspective that I'm seeking to produce, to share these ideas with you. Next slide, please. So the first frame, if you like, for how social protection is presented as a policy paradigm is rooted in the social risk management approach, which we could argue is the most dominant approach for conceptualizing policy interventions in the MENA region, as perhaps elsewhere in the world. Certainly the focus on cash transfers could be seen as part of this paradigm, and is one that particularly some international donors, the World Bank, perhaps some of the UNICEF, the UN agencies have promoted. And the approach of the social risk management frame is really to emphasize the importance of consumption smoothing, and happens in in a much more targeted social assistance approach, albeit non-contributory in many cases. And the idea is to protect the poor against risks, but also to support them in taking risks in order to participate in economic activities. And of course, there is a growing literature around the graduation of service users from the programs that have a cash transfer element. But the question still remains the extent to which such programs can be scaled up, for example, in the MENA region, or how far they are able to promote graduation. Next slide, please. A second frame of reference for the social protection debates that we see in the Global South, the MENA region included, but which nevertheless does not perhaps yet have a clear portfolio of policies that are related to it as such, or perhaps the evidence so far from the MENA region is not clear, is the one that you see, which is related to social justice and social contracts. So there is also a healthy debate academically and also in some government national plans where references are made to the importance for the promotion of real incomes and enhancing capabilities in the region, or the need to address the social justice concerns of workers or of ethnic minorities. This is, of course, a welcome framing of the social protection discourse, but as yet it is unclear how governments in the MENA region are adjusting their programs or establishing legislation in order to ensure that social protection can achieve these sort of more advanced set of goals, if you like, that are related to social justice and social contracts. I have a quote at the end of this slide, which is taken from Stephen Devereaux. I do apologize, there is a misspelling at the end of this term, but clearly we are moving in this frame towards a type of social protection that is more than just service delivery, but that we are speaking about the enforcement of legislation and of rights, and as yet we need that analysis in order to address the final outcomes of social protection more broadly. Next slide, please. And a final frame, which perhaps has not yet received the sort of well-established presence in the MENA region, but one which is about the importance of institutionalizing particular social programs which will address not just in a targeted way the needs of the poor or the extreme poor, but in some way are protecting against the vulnerability of the population more widely. These have been referred to in some of the literature as an ex-ante institutionalization of social protection. Perhaps we might be seeing this now in the rise of non-contributory social assistance, which is tax funded. And I think that this is an important area to consider, but still, we could argue that the social protection concept has not yet reached this kind of institutionalization, where resources are also being used for the reform of public administration, as well as thinking about how to make policies more inclusive or more accountable. Next slide, please. And so really the social protection debate, we could argue as a summary, is quite focused on this issue of public expenditure towards non-contributory social assistance, and perhaps at the expense of wider institutional or political or fiscal factors. There is a concentration between international actors and governments at quite senior level. The financing in the MENA region, as yet, it seems to be that the emphasis is more on the reform of bread or fuel subsidies and the transfer or the growth of fiscal space towards cash transfers. And the types of programs seem to be primarily in relation to targeted unconditional cash transfers. Some countries have made a move towards the expansion of health provision through private insurance companies. Some countries have sought to introduce short-term unemployment benefits, but as yet, these changes are quite early, and we still cannot say the extent to which social protection can actually be considered as a major paradigm shift in this region. Next slide, please. So kind of thinking a bit more concretely about the MENA region, let's see just the last few slides that I have to share with you. Please, can I see the next slide? Thank you. So I'd like to propose to you that there is a configuration of social policy provision in the MENA region, which really has been the status quo since most of these countries gained independence. And as you can see, hopefully fairly clearly from this slide, that we can argue that there is a categorization of social policy frameworks in this region, which sets the path for the way in which social protection appears to be developing also in this region. There has been a long tradition of non-contributory social safety nets, whether this is one-off cash assistance or food aid, that has been provided by both state and non-state actors in this region. And religious organizations have been especially active in this field. And family allowances, for example, are a staple of what a large number of religious organizations provide in the region to female-headed households, to households that have orphan children or elderly or disabled people. So the logic of social assistance and cash transfers has been a long-standing one in the MENA region. Similarly, employment-based social insurance has been for as large as the formal working population has existed, whether it's public sector or private sector, that too has been a very important logic in this region, because we know a much larger proportion of the population is employed in the informal sector. So that would be a very important element for perhaps the social protection debate to consider. And thirdly, there is a kind of a vague pillar or rationale of social policy in this region around needs satisfaction, which to a certain extent is fulfilled by the statutory provision of health or education or housing in some countries. So if we take the example of health or education, in law at least, most MENA or Arab countries have public health or public schooling, whether it's secondary or primary, but the extent to which these reach the populations in need, are of a good enough quality, are not perhaps used more by the middle classes than they are by the more working classes, remains open to question. So what I'm trying to show with this slide is that there is a pre-existing institutional configuration of social protection in the MENA region, which in a sense, really, the new paradigm of social protection that we are seeing fits into this existing institutional framework. And that's why it's very important for us to ask, how is the social protection approach changing the status quo or improving the status quo? Next slide, please. Thank you. So one way of considering this is to think about the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring. There was an array of activity in a variety of countries in the region, and I'm listing some of the important developments that have happened after the Arab Spring. But I would argue that perhaps what we have seen is a persistent logic of targeted social assistance in this region in spite of the Arab Spring. Perhaps Tunisia was most successful in pursuing an agenda of constitutional reform, but the majority of countries have adopted a form of cash assistance, or, as I said before, a kind of an expansion of employment-based health insurance, or limited unemployment insurance for youth. And even in countries such as Iran, who tried and experimented with the idea of a universal basic income, were not able to effectively see this through in a sustainable way. And of course, more recently, there are the events in Jordan, which see this cutting back of the subsidies. So the logic of a targeted social assistance approach has continued in this region. Next slide, please. And on this basis, to reinforce this idea, I would like to share with you a graph that I also used in the article in the Policy in Focus magazine for the IPC-IG. This is data that was shared with me by the OECD office. It is based on World Bank data, and is data they had calculated at the beginnings of the interest in social assistance, when we were beginning to have data available that would be compared across regions. So it's a rough and ready presentation, and it's a graph I will go back to work in with a bit more detail with the permission of the OECD and the World Bank. As you can see, it's historical data. Hopefully you can see from the legends there that there is a comparison of expenditures as a percentage of GDP across all world regions. Included in the data is social assistance, social insurance, education, and health. The Middle East and North Africa region, sorry, I would like to focus in particular on the blue bar, which is the social assistance expenditure. The red bar is the social insurance expenditure. So if we compare for the Middle East and North Africa region, the blue bar with the red bar, we can see very clearly that the expenditure on the blue bar, which is the social assistance expenditure, is much higher. In fact, it is the highest in the world, the second highest being Sub-Saharan Africa, which is again a region that is experiencing social protection, perhaps as a policy approach in fairly similar ways to the MENA region. So I would simply like to raise this issue of a tradition of social assistance, targeted social assistance, primarily through cash and also some in kind, as being predominant in the MENA region, and therefore asking the question of how far the interest in social protection and the rise of non-contributory social assistance is a departure from what we have already been seeing in this region. Next slide, please. So by way of a conclusion, I'm perhaps proposing perhaps a slightly controversial proposal, which is that, sorry, it says social assistance, but also the social protection paradigm. What I would like to propose is that perhaps this is not disturbing the political and institutional status quo in the region. And this in part explains the salience of the concept and the way amongst governments, as well as the attachment to conditional donor funding, and that it's important to question this. And I go back to the three frames I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that perhaps the social risk management approach fits well with the approach, with the social assistance approach that a lot of MENA countries have followed. I would also propose the importance of us as researchers and practitioners thinking about how we critically explore the consequences and the policy outcomes of social protection and their impact on the expansion of social and economic rights, rather than the reduction of poverty, and but actually to think about much bigger questions in relation to the reduction of social inequalities. And as such, and there is an argument proposed by other researchers in this field, not just myself, that we need to perhaps think creatively, that the answer might not necessarily lie in more or less social protection, but rather about the more fundamental public policy outcomes in relation to social inequalities, and how policies can enhance social solidarity more broadly. I mean, I would end with the final thought that the Arab Spring itself was made up not just of, in fact, probably the larger proportion of the Arab Spring were the middle classes, who felt politically and socially disenfranchised as well. So I think that it's important perhaps that we use social protection as a window to speak about these wider political and institutional issues affecting this region. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I did not go over my time limit. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rana, for this really insightful presentation. I think, yeah, it was really interesting to take a bit more of a historical perspective also on social protection, looking at some of the more, yeah, maybe political factors and institutional factors that maybe don't always get the attention they deserve in the more technical discussions that we often hear about social protection, especially by, yeah, bigger international development agencies. So thanks a lot for that. I'm sure the audience will have some questions. And I'd like to remind everyone listening to send their question through the chat bar. We'll address them, we collect them and address them after Markus' presentation. So now I would like to give the floor to Markus Loewe.
Hello, Charlotte. Hello, Rana. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. It's a great honor for me. I'm happy to talk with you. I would like to discuss my presentation afterwards with all of you. It's a pity I can't see you. But, well, anyhow. So I'm going to talk about pension schemes in the Middle East. So I'm going to talk much more on contributory schemes in this region, particularly old age schemes. However, I think that the problems that I will mention are very much symptomatic for many other contributory schemes in the region, and perhaps to some degree also for social protection in general. So next slide, please. So what I am trying to show during the next 15 to 20 minutes is that the pension schemes in the MENA region, they face multiple challenges with regard to social fairness, efficiency, and sustainability. And this is despite the fact that they don't lack funding. So funding is not the main issue, at least in most countries in the region. What I'm going to show also is that few countries have tried to implement tangible reforms in the area. There have been efforts in some countries, in particular Tunisia, to raise coverage rates. Jordan has made a major effort successfully in merging its pension schemes, and there have been plans in some countries in the region, among them Egypt, to replace the existing pay-as-you-go schemes by funded schemes, but none of these countries has ever implemented these plans. So some countries have implemented parametric reforms, but at large, the reforms have not taken place, with some very few examples. And I will conclude my presentations that apparently policymakers in this region are very reluctant to implement very due reforms, even if these are important to improve the equity or sustainability of pension schemes, and that this has a lot to do with political economy factors. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges for the existing pension schemes? Next, please. As Rana has already shown, funding is not the main challenge. I have another graph here which shows spending in MENA countries on social protection and health. Well, this graph, in contrast to the one presented by Rana, does not include education. However, it includes subsidies, so indirect social transfers. And as you can see from it, is that the Middle East and North Africa is spending much more on social protection and public health, at least on average, than countries in other parts of the world. Next. These graphs shows very much the same. Here I have plotted all countries for which data have been available. Well, these are a bit historical data as well. They are all pre-rebellion years, because more recent data are very difficult to get, if at least reliable data. And as you can see, the MENA countries, which are represented by green squares, are on average much higher on the y-axis, which shows public spending on social protection and health as a percentage of GDP, than other countries with the same GDP per capita, other countries in other world regions, which are represented by the dots, by the smaller dots in other colors. Please, next one. So what are the challenges? I'm going to show during the next slides that the main challenges are: first, low effective coverage rates. Second, pension schemes are very fragmented. So there's different schemes for different parts of the population, which raises question of equity. Third, we have elements of regressive redistribution in these schemes. And finally, deficits in efficiency and sustainability. Next, please. So the first challenge. This plot once again shows all countries for which data have been available, once again pre-rebellion data for different MENA and other countries. On the y-axis, you have the effective coverage rate of all pension schemes in a country, and on the x-axis, you have gross national income per capita. And as you can see, there's quite a number of countries worldwide, even middle-income countries, that have achieved considerable coverage rates for their pension schemes. But in the MENA region, just 5 countries had achieved, before 2011, coverage rates going beyond 40% of the population. These were Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, and Jordan. Of course, the data for Libya are not correct anymore, and for the other 4 countries, according to different statistics, we have seen that coverage rates have gone down again. Next, please. The main reason for these low effective coverage rates is gaps in legal coverage. So most pension schemes in the MENA region exclude large parts of the population from coverage by law. So in all countries, the army, civil servants, and other employees in the public sector are covered. Some countries also include other groups of the population, but most countries exclude by law temporary employees, self-employees and employers, domestic workers, and several countries, especially Gulf countries, even all kinds of foreigners. This means that the whole informal sector is excluded in the bulk of MENA countries, and as we know, the informal sector represents approximately half of the labor force in these countries. Next, please. Next. So this triangle represents an ideal society in a MENA country. So it shows that there is few rich on the top, many poor on the bottom, and then there's a line differentiating between the informal sector and the formal sector. Why is it shaped in this way? Because, as we know, all people in the informal sector, now all poor are in the informal sector, but not all people in the informal sector are poor. There are also some people who have a bit higher incomes, even in the informal sector. And when we look how people and if people are covered by the existing pension schemes in the region, we can see that typically in the MENA region, there's a very small share of the population at the very top, which is covered by private life and health insurance. This share ranges from below 1% in several low and lower middle income countries to 12% in Lebanon. Then we have some share of the population, which is an average 5 to 8% of the population, which are covered by non-contributory pension schemes. These are typically the armed forces and higher ranked state employees who benefit from pensions even though they have not contributed to any pension scheme. Then we have in almost all countries a contributory social insurance pension, which is the orange shaded field. These are typically some 36 to 52% of the population. The share here, with this graph here shows Egypt, so the whole formal sector is covered. Then we have some 5% of the informal sector who are also in Egypt covered, but not in the bulk of the MENA countries. And at the very bottom, we have some targeted social assistance schemes. We have some part of the population who benefit from subsidized basic social insurance pension in Egypt, but not in the other parts of the MENA region. So it's a very small share who really benefit from regular social assistance, so that there is a large part of the population in between, especially in the informal sector, who are not covered by any formal pension scheme. So these people still depend on the support of the family, of their neighbors, of their colleagues once they get to old age. And of course, these traditional and informal ways of social protection, they are not reliable, they are not sustainable. And as we know, the share of people who really support each other is declining in all parts of the world. Next slide, please. Another issue is that many schemes in the region suffer from regressive redistribution. So this chart represents the situation in Jordan in the mid-2005 to mid-2000s, in the year 2005. The problem is I have data only for Jordan for this very short period, and Jordan is the only country that has overcome this very situation. But these data are representative for many other MENA countries. So you have different schemes for different parts of the population. So at the top, we have a bar that represents how well the armed forces are covered. The very fact that this bar is pretty broad tells us also something on social protection in Jordan, because large parts of the population are simply in the armed forces in order to provide some social protection, some employment, and thereby some social protection to some parts of the poorer groups of the population in Jordan. Below that, we have a bar representing civil servants, and below that, two bars representing formal employees of private firms. I will come back to that later. At the bottom, we have people in the informal sector, those living above and those living below the national poverty line, and those living below the national poverty line in gross terms benefit more than those above the poverty line. Now the bars show gross per capita receipts from government budget. That means that people who contribute to their own social protection, their own pension funds, they would have a bar of 0 because they pay in just as much as they get out of the schemes. So the armed forces and civil servants, they have huge red bars. Why? Because they benefit from non-contributory schemes. In addition to that, we have another red bar at the lower end of those who are covered by the contributory social insurance scheme. These are people who would have a right and entitlement on a pension that is below a minimum pension threshold. And there's a provision in the legislation, the law, and the social insurance law in Jordan, which says that everybody who has a pension below this minimum income threshold should get an add-up sum to their pensions. Now this looks like a very progressive element. However, the costs of these minimum pensions were covered at that period by the central government budget. The central government budget is financed by taxes. And as we all know, the bulk of taxes in countries in the MENA region are indirect taxes. We have to keep in mind who pays indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are paid by the entire population, so including the rich, including the poor. This means that if people who are in the informal sector, who do not benefit from this scheme at all, contribute to the funding of an element that benefits the poorer parts of those who are covered by the scheme. So in the end, this element is not progressive, it's regressive, because the very poor contribute to an element that benefits the lower middle income group people in the society. As I said, I have to stress once again, Jordan has overcome the situation, but it looks still very much the same in other parts of the MENA region. And I mention this because it shows how much we have to take care that even elements that look like progressive elements can be regressive because of the funding of these elements through taxes which are borne by the entire population. So a subsidization to a scheme that excludes large parts of the population, especially the poor, can be a regressive element. Next slide, please. So the fourth challenge is that pension schemes in the region are show deficits in terms of efficiency and sustainability. First, several of them have very high administration costs. Administration costs are as high as 25% in Bahrain, 32% in Mauritania, and even 47% in Oman. There is huge incentives for manipulation in several schemes in the region. Why? Because the pensions are calculated on the basis of contributions paid in only during the last 3 to 5 years of work time. So there is an incentive for employers and employees to over-report wages during these last 3 to 5 years, because that raises the pension levels of the employees, while under-reporting the wages during the preceding years, because the contributions paid before have no effect at all on the level of pensions. And that means that there is a possibility to really reduce the contributions and to maximize pensions. And the higher the progression in the level of income has been for over lifetime, which is in particular true for higher income groups, the higher is the possibility for manipulation. In addition, some countries have very generous minimum pension rules. I have mentioned that already. It was so the minimum pension rule is 3 times the poverty line in Algeria, 2.5 times in Jordan, just to give some examples. Then there is very generous early retirement options. So in the past, I have to stress again, in the previous Jordanian military scheme, people could retire at age 32 after just 15 years in service and receive an old age pension. And until today, in the general schemes of both Jordan and Bahrain, people can theoretically retire at age 35. Finally, most pension schemes in the region are partially funded schemes. That means that they have some reserves. They accumulate reserves at least during the maturing time of their existence. And these reserves had to be given in many countries for long times to the government for a very low interest rate. In Egypt, for example, during the 1980s, this is probably the most extreme example, the reserves were given to the National Investment Bank at an interest rate of 6%, while inflation stood at 20%, so that the real interest rate was negative by -14%. In addition to the fact that there is, of course, the question if governments can ever pay back the reserves once pension schemes have higher pension outpays than they have contribution receipts. Next slide, please. So what have MENA countries done so far to reform their pension schemes? Next, please. And I said some countries have implemented some parametric reforms. So Oman, Kuwait, Jordan, and Lebanon have all established an independent investment unit in order to raise the return to invested reserves. Jordan and Yemen have raised the minimum age of retirement. Egypt, for example, has kept pension levels in order to reduce the deficits in the scheme. Jordan has reduced minimum pension rules, and Algeria, Tunisia, and Yemen have increased pensions, now index pension levels to changes in average wages. So now pensions are based on lifetime incomes, so that there is no longer an incentive to manipulate wage declarations. Next, please. However, there have been very few attempts to implement systemic reforms. Next, please. So Jordan was the only country that has overcome the split in its pension schemes for several groups of the population to be merged into one scheme. So this is really a considerable success, because it means that all those who are covered are treated by the same rules in the same scheme. Next, please. Some countries have made efforts to raise the overall coverage rate of pension schemes by including informal sector workers into the schemes. That includes Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, Libya, and Tunisia. And especially Libya and Tunisia have been rather successful in this regard. I will show some slides afterwards. Next, please. Also, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and the Palestinian territories have had plans to replace the existing pay-as-you-go or partially funded schemes by funded pension schemes, but these plans have never been implemented in either of these countries. Next, please. So what has Tunisia done? Also, all this has happened before the rebellion in 2011 to increase the effective coverage rate in Tunisia. Next, please. So Tunisia had more or less 4 pension schemes in the past. They were run by 2 different bodies, 3 by the Caisse nationale de retraite et de prévoyance sociale. These schemes were for civil servants and military employees, for members of the government, parliament, and governors, for employees in the energy sector. And the 4th scheme was run by the Caisse nationale de sécurité sociale tunisienne, which was for employees of private formal sector companies outside agriculture. So neither the informal sector nor the agricultural employees were covered until the 1980s. In the 1980s, for the first time, a scheme was created for employees in agriculture, 2 schemes, one in 1981 and then an improved system in 1989. The difference was that the first scheme was very much designed in a way that the government perceived as useful for employees in agriculture, but very few employees in agriculture enrolled with the system. So the government created another system, and before it did so, it asked agricultural workers, how should that scheme look like? So they adapted the scheme, the rules of the new scheme, to the preferences of agricultural workers, and all of a sudden a huge share of people working in agriculture enrolled with that scheme that was implemented in 1989. Then they created additional schemes step by step for members of agricultural cooperatives, for self-employees outside and in agriculture, for migrant workers abroad, for students, and finally in the 2000s for low-income earners such as domestic workers, independent fishermen, small farmers, self-employed artisans, and finally intellectual and artists. So at the end of that period, so before the so-called rebellion, the coverage rate in Tunisia was about 80% of the employed population. So how has the government achieved such a high coverage rate? Next, please. So there's different factors. First, there was a very strong commitment, not only of policymakers to implement these reforms, but also there was an intensive monitoring in the public administration so that these reforms were implemented. And the government drove awareness campaigns in TV, in newspapers, in other media among the target group to demonstrate how important it is to enroll with either of these pension schemes to protect for old age. And there was intensive monitoring of enrollment and contribution payment. So social workers were walking around and trying to make sure that people who were employed or self-employed anywhere were enrolled in either of these schemes. Fourth, there was possibilities to sanction the non-declaration of employment or income by employers, so that employers had little incentives not to declare their workers at the Social Security. Then the government provided financial incentives. It provided subsidies to the contributions made at least by very low income earners. And as I said before, the government differentiated between different benefit packages by income level, social group, location, kind of employment. So this really helped to tailor the benefit package of the different schemes to the needs and preferences of these different social groups. And finally, the government provided a customer service. It was certainly not perfect, but it was much better than the customer service in many other countries of the MENA region. So what does it show? It shows that if a government is committed and is ready to provide some financial incentives, it is possible to increase the coverage rate of pension schemes, even in middle-income countries, to at least 80% of the population, and perhaps even more. Unfortunately, after the Arab Rebellion, coverage rates have first been reduced a little bit, which has, of course, also to do with the rise in unemployment. Next slide, please. I would like to mention one last issue, one last attempt to reform pension schemes, and that's the case of Egypt. Next slide, please. So, even before the Arab Rebellion, there were plans to reform the Egyptian pay-as-you-go scheme by funded scheme, and thereby to overcome some of the deficits of the existing scheme. So in June 2010, Parliament passed a law to establish a new pension scheme in Egypt. This law provided for mandatory membership for all labor market entrants. Members of the old system would have had the choice to remain either in the old system or to change to the new system. In the new scheme, contribution rates would have been much lower than the old scheme, but without an upper ceiling. So the rationale was that contributions were to be paid on all labor income. So the poor would have paid a bit less than before, while the rich would have paid much more into the system. Informal sector workers were meant to be fully covered, all of them, and their contributions to be topped up by a 25% subsidy to be paid by the Treasury. Pension levels were meant to be computed from all contributions ever paid into the system rather than just from the last 3 to 5 years. And the reform included a number of other elements. When the law was published in Egypt, there was a lot of resistance. Some criticism for good reasons, other criticism because some actors simply thought that they would lose the privileges that they had in the old system. So the implementation of the reform was put on ice for half a year. Then came the Arab Rebellion, and after the Arab Rebellion, during the first months, the implementation was entirely stopped, and there has been no further try to reform the Egyptian pension scheme. Next slide, please. What can we conclude from all these information? Next, please. First of all, as I said in the beginning, it's not about funding. MENA countries spend a lot on social protection. The problem is how they prioritize different social protection schemes and how they use the funds within even their social protection schemes, for example, within the pension schemes. Likewise, it's not about the lack of technical administrative know-how. This know-how exists, and even if it was needed, most Arab countries could easily buy it in. So the problem is political factors. Most countries in the region do not dare to reform the existing social protection systems, to implement urgently needed reforms, because these reforms might hurt certain groups of the population who now benefit from the privileges of the existing schemes. And these groups of the population are often the constituency or other influence of the regimes or other influential social groups. So especially the Republican regimes in the region have to perform in social policies, but mainly vis-à-vis the urban middle class who now benefit, especially from schemes like the pension schemes, and they have to do so in order to legitimize their rule. But they benefit, but they have to legitimize much less vis-à-vis the poor, who are much less well organized. Next, please. Therefore, governments are reluctant to implement more comprehensive reforms. They are worried that reforms might be at the expense of more powerful and other strategically important social groups, and they are worried that reforms might consume significant financial resources that the government could need elsewhere, such as for legitimizing the rule vis-à-vis the middle class. Thank you very much. Next, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Markus, for this really interesting presentation on the public pension schemes in the region. I think it was particularly interesting to hear that, just as Rana also mentioned already, apparently funding is not the main issue, but rather political factors seem to hinder reforms in the area of social protection or public pension schemes in particular. So we've already received a couple of questions. Yes, and if the audience has more questions, please, you still have time to send them through the chat bar. We have a couple of minutes left in case we cannot address them all in this Q&A session. We will collect them and post them in the online community after the webinar. So the first set of questions to Rana. Rana, Arthur van Diesen from the UNICEF Menaro is asking, how do you think the shifts you're noting in social protection provision in MENA relate to social cohesion? So does the increasing focus on poverty target social assistance help or hinder greater social cohesion in the countries in the region? And then Arthur is also asking to Rana, how well are adolescents and young people served by social protection measures in MENA? This especially in view of the high levels of youth employment. And then the third and last question for this, in this first round of questions to Rana, is from Luca Pellaroni, asking, we heard about shift from universal subsidies to targeted social assistance. These are often justified on equity grounds, as subsidies are believed to be regressive. What do we know about the impact of such reforms on overall income distribution, particularly the middle class, and inequality overall? So I'd like to hand over to Rana if you could address those questions, and then we'll have a set of questions to Markus. Rana, I believe you need to unmute your microphone. Rana, if you can click on the green microphone.
And here it is. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I hadn't realized I had to do that. Thank you. Okay, so I saw some of those questions. Hopefully I'll reply to them clearly here. So on Arthur's first question on solidarity, I have it, I think that's very extensive research across a lot of programs, and I always answer with caution. I think one sort of implication of coming at the social protection question from an institutional perspective is to potentially argue that if the programs are being delivered through the same kinds of institutions with the same kinds of logic, then there is still a question to ask in relation to how socially cohesive they are. I mean, having said this, there is even conflicting data from the Latin American experience, for example, on cash transfers, where different communities began to experience some hostility because some communities were benefiting from cash transfers and others weren't. I think the question of social cohesion and social solidarity is a very big one. Clearly, there are direct government interventions that could promote that, that enhance issues related to citizenship or economic and social rights. Some of the data that emerged from the Arab Barometer, for example, is quite interesting in pointing in the direction of the need for employment creation and for affordability issues and basic standard of living matters, and that Arab populations appear to direct responsibility towards the state in that. Of course, that's for the Arab populations, and here we're talking about a much larger MENA population. I wouldn't want to undermine the benefits of the targeted social assistance programs, and that clearly there is also research that shows that where these are reaching extremely poor or marginalized groups, clearly access to cash will make a difference to day-to-day survival, whether this is immediate consumption smoothing or immediate psychological benefits. But clearly the question of solidarity is one that cuts across the classes, which is why the question of inequality matters. And targeted programs will have a visible effect. But questions of solidarity or cohesion or the social contract, these are political questions. Which can be addressed through direct mechanisms, but also, there might be also indirect mechanisms, and historically there are examples of this in various parts of the world. With respect to youth and young people, I think probably one of the biggest forms of evidence in relation to the situation of young people is the high rate of migration. Which continues to be quite significant in this region, whether we are seeing it in the form of the crises in the northern Mediterranean and the containment in the southern Mediterranean and the containment of refugee and migrant populations in particular countries in the southern Mediterranean, or whether it's through direct, application for migration procedures from the skilled or university educated youth that are coming out of the education system. So I think that that's a really important signal of the situation for young people. But of course, there are other young people, if you like, who are benefiting from the status quo. I can only mention the Lebanese elections, which have recently taken place, and we now see the young men, because they are mainly men, who are inheriting power from their fathers and their families, so I think young people have it both ways in the MENA region, depending on what their political connections are. This is very sad for me to say, being originally from this region myself, but this is the reality that has to be addressed. I'm trying to remember the other question. Charlotte, would you mind reminding me of the third question, please?
Yes, sure. The third question would be about the impact of the subsidy reforms on the overall income distribution, particularly the middle class, and inequality overall.
Yes, this is absolutely the next question, certainly for research purposes. Of course, we don't want to write this off. The World Bank produced a very strong argument for subsidy reform in 2012, the report that was led by Joana da Silva and other authors. There was clearly some, quite convincing data that was used in there to show that the subsidies are not the best way of using public expenditure, and clearly we see from Markus's work as well that a lot of the public service benefits are being used by the populations that perhaps might not be directly in need of them. So I do think that this is definitely a space that requires further research. I think in principle the question of subsidies is an interesting one. Perhaps we should think about subsidies on means of production rather than consumption. I think that's the first thing to say. I don't think agricultural policy in Europe or in Northern America would have succeeded without some form of subsidization, which continues to this day. I think it's the logic of developing the industrial sectors or the economies of the MENA region. This seems to be the big gap, and perhaps it's not just subsidies outright. So firstly, I would say perhaps we need a shift in focus. But secondly, there are other arguments, for example, in the context of India or in the South Asian continent, where subsidies on food and fuel actually have been seen as having a very positive impact on inflation. So I don't think the argument is one outright against subsidies. This is an argument that's been put forward by Ghosh, who's working on the Indian continent as well. So I think that there are various arguments to consider, but certainly additional research needs to be done. Does that answer all of the questions?
Okay, thank you, Rana. Yes, I would like to address the next set of questions to Markus. Maybe Markus, if you also would like to comment on this last questions on the subsidy reforms, I'm sure the audience will be interested in hearing your stake. And then another question from Kristina Popivanova. I apologize for any mispronunciation. She is curious about hearing more in terms of policy shifts in social protection in the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf countries. So if you have any input, any comments on that, Markus, over to you.
I'm very sorry. I think I cannot say anything about recent developments in the UAE. I have followed the trends until about a couple of years ago, but I can't say anything on recent trends, unfortunately. The only shift that I see that, fortunately, some of the Gulf countries are now considering to create contributory schemes for pensions and for health insurance, also for migrant workers living in these countries. Until then, they have been without any social protection against these risks in most of these countries. Now they either include them, some consider to include them in social insurance, others create at least private contributory schemes. Yes, but I would really like to add on the question about subsidies. The subsidies, we must see, have been criticized for different reasons. I would like to mention mainly two. The one is the equity issue. And here we must be very cautious. I agree with Rana, what kind of such subsidies we are talking about. The bulk of the subsidies has been for energy subsidies. And here, in fact, the bulk of spending has gone to the rich rather than the poor. This has to do with the fact that the poor don't own a car. This has to do, they don't have the same kind of equipment in their households, etc., etc. So by definition, the spending on energy is much higher among the rich than among the poor, and thereby these kinds of subsidies are very much regressive. This is different for food subsidies. Food subsidies are not that regressive. We have to admit they are also not very progressive. So they also benefit the rich, but it's a very, at least it's a very different case. And then we have some kinds of subsidies, like the ones that Rana mentioned, agricultural subsidies, or I would rather shift the focus to education subsidies, health subsidies. These are subsidies as well, and these subsidies can even be a little bit progressive because the poor benefit more than the rich. The problem about the replacement of subsidies through direct transfers is that most countries replace the universal subsidies by targeted direct transfers. However, targeting mechanisms in these countries tend to be very poor. This is not just true for MENA countries. This is true for almost all middle-income countries. I would even go so far to say, in most cases, targeting doesn't work. Even if you spend a lot of money and a lot of energy on filtering out the rich or the middle rich and so on, just to target the poor, in the end, you have huge errors of exclusion, huge errors of inclusion, to the point that these targeted direct transfers are almost as little progressive as, say, for example, food subsidies. That's a big problem. So in many countries, it's just a lottery. Some poor benefit, some poor don't benefit. So what Iran has done of replacing targeted transfers by universal transfers, I would say is theoretically the right way to go. Why? Universal transfers have one big advantage. They include all the rich as well. But at least they include also all the poor. And why are they better than indirect transfers, meaning subsidies? Well, this is the second reason against subsidies that I mentioned before. Subsidies are also problematic because they incentivize the consumption of certain goods. They incentivize the consumption of energy. They incentivize the consumption of certain food items and so on. As long as these are products like health and education, it's good. But if it's products like energy, it's not only bad for environmental reasons, but also because then the rich can afford to consume even more of it. So the question should not be have universal subsidies or targeted direct transfers, but the alternative should be, should we have universal subsidies? And if so, what kind of? Or should we have universal direct transfers? And I've seen from a comment of one of the participants, much more at the top, asking, so where has been the engagement, for example, of the World Bank in that regard? And in fact, in the operational parts of the business of the World Bank, we have seen not too much engagement in that direction. But the next World Development Report, 2019, which will be on the effect of digitalization on labor markets, will take a very different stance. In that report, at least in the draft version that has been circulated recently, we see a very strong position of the authors for universal cash transfers in low and middle income countries, to be financed either by the countries themselves or by international donors.
Thank you, Markus, for your comment. The next two questions for Rana both relate to the topic of refugees and host countries. The first one from Cecilia Pietrobono. She's asking, how do you see the sustainability, longer-term vision of social measures targeting refugees, being them non-contributory or dependent on international funds? And do you see that there will be an integration into the national systems? And she's also asking, where do you see the role of the host government? A similar question from Professor Sevinç Rende from the Social Policy Research Center in Istanbul. He is also asking, how do you evaluate the intersections between the donors, refugee population, and the fiscal space left to the governments in the MENA region? And then specifically, he's referring to Jordan.
Thank you. Yes, I read those two questions, and the humanitarian issue and the refugee crisis is a very sensitive one, and any person fleeing war or persecution, you know, should find a safe haven, at least in the next neighboring country. So I would absolutely support the idea, as I'm sure any researcher would, that from the perspective of helping refugee populations that are fleeing, that the neighboring countries, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Jordan, Turkey, clearly should be hosting those refugees, and that the support mechanisms should be there for them. Clearly, the reality is a bit more complicated, and I'm just trying to find the right way to explain it. I think on the issue of the integration with national systems, I think it's important to think a little bit more in depth about this question. The proposal of a new way of working that was proposed at the Istanbul summit a couple of years ago has got this interesting idea that where there are fragile states and states in conflict, states with weak capacity, it makes sense to think for donor agencies to support public services in order that these can provide the essential social protection needs and health and education for both the local population and the humanitarian and the refugees that are fleeing from war. And clearly, an important impetus for the interest in social protection in the MENA region has been the humanitarian crisis. So it hasn't just been specific interest in poverty reduction at a national level for these countries. But we still have to ask the question of the populations themselves. There has been clear documentation of tensions, whether it's in Lebanon or in Jordan. These are countries that are already struggling to provide adequate public services for their own populations. So there clearly has been some tension created as a result of this approach of integrating national systems in order to integrate the refugee populations. I think that this is a reality that we need to address, of how feasible and desirable these countries are able to support the refugee populations and also deal with the needs of their own populations. I don't know that that question has been resolved. I think that there are political pressures in the region. Some countries potentially might be more open to the idea of integration because there is going to be funding tied to that. And I think certainly that is the case for Lebanon. I think that it's still an unfolding story. In principle, of course, refugees should be accommodated. But I think that whether we like it or not, and as much as we try to separate out the geopolitical issues in this region, they might be intervening in this area, and it's an area it's a space to watch. And as a result, in terms of the second question, I think that governments are in a bit of a catch-22 situation. So the example of certainly Jordan and Lebanon, who are quite dependent on international donor funding, but at the same time have their own political priorities and calculations to keep in mind of. I think that there is going to be some compromise. And I think that, again, the Lebanon example, in the last a couple of weeks, there has been a lot of debate in Parliament and in the public with regards to new legislation to naturalize some of the refugee populations that have arrived in Lebanon, and that must have some relationship with the donor agencies. So it's a kind of a the reality of politics in the region, and how I think it perhaps intersects with the questions of social protection that we're also discussing.
Okay, thank you very much, Rana. I'm afraid we're coming to the end of today's webinar. We're running a bit out of time, but we've received many questions, and we'll make sure to collect them all and to post them and share them with our speakers first, and then post the answers in the online community, and we'll also share them via the follow-up email, which you will receive from socialprotection.org. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and thank you for your questions. Thanks also to Rana and Markus for these two really excellent presentations, and thank you for sharing your views and experiences. I would also like to thank the team of socialprotection.org, and I hope to see everyone in the next webinar, which will be announced in our online community too. So I'll end the webinar here. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.